Please, Eleanor, forgive me. The words cut through the warm Manhattan evening like a knife. 5,000 people in Central Park's great lawn fell silent as André Rieu, the world's most celebrated violinist, knelt on the grass before an elderly woman in a wheelchair. His violin lay forgotten beside him, his tuxedo soaked with tears, his voice breaking with 30 years of buried pain. The woman looked down at him, her weathered hands trembling on her wheelchair's armrests, and in that moment everyone present knew they were witnessing something far more powerful than any concert they had ever attended. If you're listening to this incredible true story from anywhere across the United States and you believe in the transformative power of forgiveness and love, please hit that subscribe button right now and let me know in the comments what city you're calling from and how old you are. This story will change how you think about second chances, regret, and the courage it takes to make things right after decades of silence. It had been a perfect summer evening in New York City, the kind of night that made Central Park feel like magic was possible. The sun was setting behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as thousands of people gathered for André Rieu's annual summer concert. Families had arrived hours early, spreading blankets on the great lawn and setting up folding chairs in neat rows. Children ran between the trees while their parents unpacked picnic baskets and wine glasses, everyone buzzing with anticipation for what promised to be an unforgettable night of music. The temporary stage had been erected at one end of the lawn, adorned with twinkling lights and massive speakers that would carry André's legendary sound to every corner of the park. This wasn't just any concert. It was the cultural event that classical music lovers throughout the tri-state area had been anticipating all year. Tickets had sold out within minutes of going on sale 6 months earlier, and tonight's audience included everyone from longtime fans who had followed André's career for decades to curious newcomers drawn by his reputation for making classical music accessible and joyful. In the front section, specifically designated for wheelchair accessibility and VIP ticket holders, sat Eleanor Richardson. At 91 years old, she cut a distinguished figure despite her frailty. Her silver hair was perfectly styled in soft waves that caught the early evening light, and she wore a navy blue dress that she had chosen specifically for this occasion, a dress that held memories of concerts from decades past. Her weathered hands, marked by age spots and the slight tremor that comes with advanced years, rested carefully on the armrests of her wheelchair, but her eyes, those intelligent, penetrating blue eyes, were fixed on the stage with an intensity that made her grandson deeply uncomfortable. Those eyes had seen nearly a century of life, had witnessed the Great Depression as a child, had watched loved ones leave for World War II and not return, had celebrated victories and mourned losses that most people couldn't imagine. But tonight, they held a particular weight, a mixture of anticipation and something that looked almost like dread. Timothy Greenfield, her 34-year-old grandson, shifted nervously in the metal folding chair he had positioned directly beside her wheelchair. He had spent 3 months organizing this evening, calling in favors and navigating bureaucratic red tape to secure the special access tickets that would place his grandmother in the front row. Getting tickets for André Rieu's concerts was notoriously difficult, but when his grandmother had asked, no, demanded, to attend this particular performance, he couldn't refuse. She rarely asked for anything, and after raising him single-handedly following his parents' death in a car accident when he was 8 years old, he owed her everything. "Grandma," Timothy whispered, leaning close to her ear as he adjusted the soft fleece blanket across her lap. The evening air was beginning to cool, and he worried about her circulation. "Are you absolutely sure you're up for this? It's going to be a long evening, and with all these crowds and the noise level." He gestured toward the thousands of people still arriving, many carrying lawn chairs and coolers, their voices creating a steady hum of excitement. Eleanor's gaze never wavered from the stage where members of the Johann Strauss Orchestra were beginning to emerge from the wings, carrying their instruments and taking their positions. "Timothy," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her such an effective professor during her 40-year career at Columbia University, "I've waited my entire life for this moment. A little fatigue and some crowd noise isn't going to stop me now." But Timothy could sense there was far more to her words than simple enthusiasm for classical music. There was a tension in her shoulders that he had never seen before, a weight she carried that seemed to press down on her small frame. Her usually steady hands had been shaking slightly all day, and she had barely touched the dinner he had prepared for her at her assisted living facility before they left for the concert. "Grandma," he pressed gently, "why is this specific concert so important to you? I mean, I know you've always loved classical music. You taught me to appreciate it, but you haven't been to a live performance in over 5 years. The last time I suggested we go to Lincoln Center, you said you were too tired for such outings." Eleanor's lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's exactly why I need to be here tonight, dear one. Sometimes we avoid things that matter most, because we're afraid of how they might make us feel." Timothy wanted to ask more questions, but something in his grandmother's tone warned him that this wasn't the time. Instead, he focused on making her as comfortable as possible, ensuring her blanket was secure and that her small purse, containing her medications and the emergency phone numbers he insisted she always carry, was safely positioned within her reach. Around them, the energy was building as more concert-goers found their seats. The great lawn was filling up rapidly, with every available space being claimed by music lovers who had traveled from as far as Pennsylvania and Connecticut to be here. Children darted between the adults, their excitement infectious, while teenagers took selfies with the stage in the background, already posting to social media about their anticipation for the show. 2 rows behind Eleanor and Timothy sat Roland Matthews, a 58-year-old amateur photographer whose passion for capturing life's beautiful moments had led him to invest in professional-grade camera equipment. He was methodically adjusting his telephoto lens, testing different angles as he prepared to document the evening for his wife, Sarah, who lay in a hospital bed at Mount Sinai, recovering from her 2nd round of chemotherapy. "My wife couldn't make it tonight," Roland explained to the middle-aged couple settling into chairs beside him, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to contain. "She's been fighting cancer for the past year, and this week's treatment left her too weak to travel. But André Rieu has been her favorite musician for over 20 years. She has every one of his albums, and we've seen him perform 6 times in different cities. I promised her I'd record everything, every song, every moment, so she can experience it with me when I get back to her tomorrow morning." The woman beside him reached over and gently squeezed his arm. "She's lucky to have someone who loves her so much," she said softly. "I'm sure watching your videos will be the best medicine she could ask for." Roland nodded, blinking back tears as he continued preparing his camera. "Music has always been our language," he said. "When words aren't enough, when the fear gets too overwhelming, we put on André's concerts and dance in our living room like we're young again. Tonight, I'm going to capture every note so she doesn't miss a single moment of beauty." On the stage itself, the orchestra members were going through their pre-performance routines with the practiced efficiency of musicians who had performed together for years. Melody Chen, a 29-year-old violinist who had joined the Johann Strauss Orchestra 4 years earlier, fresh out of the Manhattan School of Music, was carefully rosening her bow while mentally reviewing the evening's challenging program. She had worked tirelessly to earn her position in André's orchestra, knowing that it represented the pinnacle of achievement for any musician interested in bringing classical music to mainstream audiences. "Look at them," Melody whispered to her stand partner Marcus Williams, a veteran violinist who had been touring with André for over a decade. She nodded toward the sea of faces spreading across the great lawn, many of which were already showing signs of emotional anticipation. "He hasn't even made his entrance yet, and I can see people crying. How does he do that? How does he create that connection before playing a single note?" Marcus, who had witnessed André's effect on audiences countless times, smiled as he tightened his bowstrings. "That's the genius of André Rieu," he replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent years studying the phenomenon of their conductor's appeal. "He understands that music isn't just about technical perfection or even artistic interpretation. It's about touching the places in people's hearts that they've forgotten existed. He reminds them that beauty is still possible in a world that often seems too harsh and complicated." Melody nodded thoughtfully as she surveyed the crowd, noting the diversity of ages represented. She could see elderly couples holding hands like teenagers, middle-aged parents introducing their children to classical music for the first time, and young adults who had probably never set foot in a traditional concert hall but were drawn by André's reputation for making the sophisticated accessible. "Do you think he knows?" she asked Marcus. "Do you think he understands how much hope he gives people? How many marriages he's saved? How many people he's helped through grief and depression? How many children he's inspired to pick up instruments?" "Oh, he knows," Marcus replied with certainty. "That's why he does what he does. That's why he chose to build a career on joy instead of pretension. Watch his face during the performance tonight. You'll see him scanning the audience, reading their emotions, adjusting his interpretation based on what he sees they need. Meanwhile, Backstage in the temporary dressing area that had been erected behind the stage, André Rieu himself was going through his own pre-performance rituals. At 74 years old, he had performed thousands of concerts in dozens of countries, but he still felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that had accompanied every important performance since his early days as a struggling musician in the Netherlands. He stood before a small mirror, adjusting his signature white bow tie and running his fingers through his distinctive curly hair, which had gone from dark brown to silver over the decades of his career. His reflection showed a man who had aged gracefully, his face lined with the evidence of countless smiles and expressions of joy, his eyes still bright with the passion that had driven him to revolutionize the way the world thought about classical music. As always before a concert, André took a moment to peek through a small gap in the backstage curtains to observe his audience. This ritual had become sacred to him over the years, a way of connecting with the energy of the crowd before he ever stepped into the spotlight. He loved seeing the faces of people who had come to share in the experience he was about to create, loved watching families claim their spots and couples hold hands in anticipation. But tonight, as his eyes swept across the front rows, searching for the familiar signs of excitement and expectation, something made him freeze completely. His heart, which had been beating with the normal pre-show adrenaline, suddenly began pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There, in the wheelchair accessibility section, sat a face he hadn't seen in over 3 decades, a face that had haunted his dreams and filled his regrets for 31 years. Eleanor Richardson, Professor Eleanor Richardson, the woman who had taught him to love music with his heart instead of just his technical skill. The woman who had believed in him when no one else would. The woman whose trust he had betrayed and whose heart he had broken in his ruthless pursuit of fame and international recognition. André's hands began trembling as memories flooded back with the force of a tsunami. He gripped the edge of the curtain to steady himself, his carefully prepared confidence crumbling in the face of a past he thought he had successfully buried. "Maestro!" came a concerned voice from behind him. It was Margaret Foster, the tour manager who had been coordinating André's American performances for over 15 years. She had noticed his sudden stillness and the pallor that had crept across his features. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." André forced himself to turn away from the curtain, but his hands continued shaking as he faced Margaret. Yes, I'm fine," he managed to say, though his voice lacked its usual warm confidence. Just gathering my thoughts before we begin." But Margaret had worked with André long enough to recognize when something was genuinely wrong. "André, you're pale as a sheet and you're shaking. Do you need medical attention? Should I call Dr. Harrison?" "No," André said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No doctors, I need a moment to compose myself. Perhaps some water?" As Margaret hurried to fetch water, André closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. But the image of Eleanor's face, older now, marked by the passage of time, but still unmistakably her, was burned into his vision. How was she here? After all these years, after everything that had happened between them, what cosmic force had brought Eleanor Richardson to his concert on this particular night? The memories began cascading through his mind, each one as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, instead of over 3 decades ago. It had been 1992 when their paths first crossed at Juilliard, where Eleanor taught advanced violin technique and musical interpretation. André had been 43 years old then, a competent but unremarkable classical musician who was struggling to find his unique voice in a world dominated by established virtuosos and traditional approaches to classical performance. He had arrived at Eleanor's studio on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, carrying a violin case that showed the wear of constant use and wearing a brown corduroy jacket that was slightly too large for his frame, probably inherited from an older brother or purchased second-hand from one of the thrift shops that struggling musicians frequented near the school. "Professor Richardson," he had said in English, still heavily accented by his Dutch origins, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation that she had heard countless times from aspiring musicians. "They tell me you're the finest teacher at Juilliard. I desperately need someone who can help me find my voice, my purpose in music. Can you help me discover what I'm meant to become?" Eleanor should have turned him away immediately. At 61, she was one of Juilliard's most respected instructors, with a waiting list of students that stretched for months and a reputation for accepting only those with exceptional promise and the financial means to afford her rates. Moreover, the school had strict policies about private instruction arrangements, and André had been painfully honest about his limited financial resources from their first meeting. "I cannot pay you what you deserve," he had admitted, his eyes downcast in embarrassment. "At least not in the traditional way, but I can work. I can clean your studio, organize your music library, help with any tasks you need. I've been loading cargo at the docks to pay for my basic lessons, but I know I need something more if I'm ever going to become the musician I dream of being." There had been something in his honesty, combined with an undeniable hunger for musical growth, that had touched Eleanor in a way she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was because she recognized in him the same passionate love for music that had driven her own career, or perhaps it was simply that his desperation reminded her of her own struggles as a young woman trying to establish herself in the male-dominated world of classical music education. "Play something for me first," she had said, settling into the chair from which she evaluated all potential students. "Show me what you can do, and then we'll discuss what you need to learn." André had unpacked his violin, an instrument that had clearly seen better days, but was meticulously maintained and obviously treasured, and positioned himself in the center of her studio. He had chosen to perform Pachelbel's Canon in D, a piece that was technically demanding but familiar enough that he could focus on expression rather than simply hitting the correct notes. For 6 minutes, he played with technical precision that was genuinely impressive. Every note was accurate, every bow stroke was clean, every dynamic marking was observed exactly as written. It was a performance that would have earned high marks in any traditional conservatory setting. But when the last note faded and André lowered his instrument, Eleanor had given him a look that contained both disappointment and possibility. "You play like a very sophisticated computer," she had told him bluntly, her words cutting through any illusions he might have had about his current level of artistry. "Every note is correct, every timing is precise, but where is your soul? Where is the story you're trying to tell? Music isn't a mathematical equation to be solved. It's a language of emotion, a conversation between your heart and the hearts of everyone who hears you play." André had stared at her, clearly confused by the criticism. "I don't understand, Professor. The music is beautiful as written. Pachelbel knew what he was doing when he composed this piece. Isn't my job to honor his intentions?" "Your job," Eleanor had replied with the passion that made her such an effective teacher, "is to take Pachelbel's notes and breathe life into them with your own experience, your own understanding of what beauty and longing and joy actually feel like. Right now you're giving me a perfect reproduction of sounds. What I need from you is music that makes me remember what it feels like to be alive." That conversation had marked the beginning of what would become the most important relationship of André's life. Eleanor had agreed to work with him 3 times a week, accepting his offer to maintain her studio and organize her extensive music library in lieu of traditional payment. But what had started as a practical arrangement had quickly evolved into something far deeper and more transformative than either of them had anticipated. Eleanor didn't just teach André technique, she taught him philosophy. She helped him understand that every note had emotional purpose, that every pause contained meaning, that music was fundamentally about creating connection between human beings who might otherwise remain strangers to each other's inner lives. "When you play Canon in D," she had told him during one of their early lessons, "don't think about the mathematical relationships between the notes. Think about what Pachelbel was feeling when he composed this piece. Think about celebration and community, and the way love feels when it's shared among people who care about each other. Then let that feeling guide your bow, and let the audience hear not just the notes, but the joy behind them." Week by week, month by month, André's playing had been transformed. Under Eleanor's guidance, he had learned to access emotional depths he hadn't known existed within himself. His technical skills, which had always been solid, became the foundation for interpretations that were increasingly personal and moving. But it wasn't just his music that was changing. The hours they spent together in her studio, discussing not just musical theory but life philosophy, literature, and the deeper purposes of art, had created an intellectual and emotional bond that neither had expected. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their sessions with an anticipation that went far beyond professional satisfaction, while André discovered that his feelings for his teacher were evolving in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The transformation had become apparent to everyone around them. Other students began commenting on the new emotional depth in André's performances. Faculty members who had previously dismissed him as competent but unremarkable started taking notice of his progress. Most significantly, Eleanor began introducing him to influential figures in New York's classical music community, concert promoters, recording industry executives, and established musicians who could provide opportunities for a talented performer seeking to build a career. "Professor Richardson," André had said one evening as they finished a particularly intensive session on interpreting Mozart, "I need to ask you something, and I hope I'm not being inappropriate." Eleanor had looked up from the sheet music she was organizing, noting the unusual seriousness in his voice. "What is it, André? Why are you doing all this for me? The lessons, the introductions, the opportunities you're creating. It goes so far beyond what any teacher would normally provide. I'm grateful beyond words, but I need to understand your motivations." Eleanor had paused for a long moment, considering how to answer a question that touched on feelings she was still trying to understand herself. "Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted," she had said finally. "Because the world needs musicians who can make people feel deeply in an age when everything seems designed to make us numb. Because," she had hesitated, then continued with characteristic honesty, "because working with you has reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." By the spring of 1994, their relationship had evolved far beyond the traditional boundaries of teacher and student. They were spending evenings together discussing music and life over wine in small restaurants throughout Manhattan, attending concerts and gallery openings as companions rather than simply as instructor and pupil. The 13-year age difference that should have been a barrier seemed irrelevant when they were lost in conversation about art and meaning and the purpose of creative expression. The moment when everything changed had come on a warm evening in May. They had been working late in Eleanor's studio, preparing André for an important audition with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, when he had suddenly stopped playing mid-phrase. "Eleanor," he had said, setting down his violin with unusual deliberateness, "there's something I need to tell you, and I can't continue pretending that these are normal lessons anymore." Eleanor had felt her heart rate accelerate, sensing that they were approaching a conversation that would change everything between them. "What is it, André?" "I'm in love with you," he had said simply, his eyes meeting hers with complete honesty. "I've been fighting these feelings for months, telling myself that it's inappropriate, that you're my teacher, that I'm imagining things that aren't there, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you, not just as a teacher, not just as a mentor, but as the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Eleanor had felt the world shift around her as he spoke. She had been trying to deny her own growing feelings, telling herself that her excitement about their time together was purely professional, that the way her heart raced when she saw him was simply enthusiasm for his musical progress. "André," she had whispered, "this is complicated. I'm your instructor. There are professional boundaries, ethical considerations. Why does it have to be complicated?" he had asked, moving closer to her. "I love you. You care about me. I can see it in your eyes, feel it in the way you've dedicated yourself to my growth. What else matters?" Eleanor had looked into his eyes and seen not just passion, but genuine love and respect. "Everything else matters," she had replied softly. "Your career, my reputation, the way people will judge us, the power dynamics of our relationship. Let them judge," André had said with characteristic intensity. "I'd rather be judged for loving you than live the rest of my life wondering what we might have had." That night had marked the beginning of 3 years that would prove to be the most complicated and meaningful of both their lives. Their relationship had remained carefully hidden from the Juilliard community and the broader classical music world, but behind closed doors, they had discovered a love that was both passionate and deeply intellectual. Eleanor had continued to nurture André's career with even greater dedication, using her connections to secure auditions and performance opportunities that gradually built his reputation. But she had been careful to maintain professional distance in public, ensuring that no one could accuse him of advancing through favoritism rather than merit. Their private time together had been spent in Eleanor's apartment overlooking Central Park, where they would practice duets late into the evening, or in small hotels in other cities when André had performances that Eleanor could attend without drawing attention. They had developed a relationship built on mutual respect, shared passion for music, and an intellectual compatibility that made conversation as important as physical attraction. "You've changed everything about the way I understand music," André had told her one evening, as they sat together in her apartment after a particularly successful performance he had given at a small venue in Brooklyn. "But more than that, you've changed everything about the way I understand myself." "You've done the same for me," Eleanor had replied honestly. I had forgotten what it felt like to see the world through someone else's eyes, to have my own assumptions challenged and expanded. You've made me remember that learning never stops, regardless of age. For 3 years they had lived in this carefully constructed bubble, finding ways to share their lives while maintaining the professional facades that protected both their careers. André's reputation had continued to grow under Eleanor's guidance, and by 1997 he was beginning to attract attention from major recording labels and international concert promoters. Then had come the offer that would destroy everything between them. It had been a February evening, with snow falling outside Eleanor's apartment windows, when André had arrived, looking more excited than she had ever seen him. "Eleanor," he had said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm, "something incredible has happened, something beyond anything I dared to dream." "Tell me," she had said, though something in his manner had made her feel inexplicably uneasy. "Universal Music Group wants to sign me," he had announced. "A full recording contract, international distribution, a marketing budget that would make me a household name. They're talking about world tours, television specials, becoming the face of accessible classical music." Eleanor had felt genuinely happy for him, knowing how hard he had worked and how much this recognition meant. "André, that's wonderful. You deserve this success more than anyone I know." But André's excitement had suddenly dimmed, and she had seen something in his expression that made her stomach clench with foreboding. "There are conditions," he had continued, no longer meeting her eyes, "about my image, my public persona, the way they want to market me to mainstream audiences." "What kind of conditions?" Eleanor had asked, though she had already begun to suspect what was coming. "They want to present me as the available bachelor of classical music," André had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Young, charming, romantically unattached. They believe that's essential to appealing to the demographic they're targeting, women between 30 and 60, who make most of the decisions about classical music purchases." Eleanor had felt the room spinning around her as the implications became clear. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I needed time to consider their offer," André had said, but she could see in his face that he had already made his decision. "You've already decided," she had said quietly. "You don't need time to consider anything. You've chosen your career over us." The fight that had followed had been devastating. Years of carefully suppressed tensions about their age difference, their professional relationship, and the sacrifices they had both made for their secret love had exploded into accusations and recriminations that cut deeper than either had intended. "This is my chance," André had pleaded. "This is everything I've worked toward my entire life. I'll never get another opportunity like this." "And what about everything we've built together?" Eleanor had demanded. "What about the love you claimed was more important than professional boundaries? What about the woman who risked her own reputation to help you achieve exactly this success?" "It doesn't have to end everything between us," André had said desperately. "We can find ways to be discreet, to see each other privately." "You want me to become your secret," Eleanor had said, her voice cold with hurt and anger. "After 3 years of being your partner in every way that mattered, you want me to hide in the shadows while you pretend to be available for your adoring public." "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant," Eleanor had interrupted. "And it's exactly what I'll never agree to become." The argument had continued for hours, with both saying things they would regret for decades to come. André had accused Eleanor of trying to hold him back out of jealousy, while Eleanor had accused him of using her for advancement, and then discarding her when convenience demanded it. "Go," Eleanor had finally said, when they were both exhausted from the emotional battle. "Take your contract, build your career, become the star you've always dreamed of being, but don't expect me to wait in the wings, grateful for whatever scraps of attention you might be able to spare." "Eleanor, please, go!" she had screamed. "Before I say something that will destroy even the memory of what we had." André had left that night, and Eleanor had never seen him again. Until tonight, 31 years later, when fate had brought her to his concert in Central Park. Now backstage, André was struggling to compose himself as Margaret returned with water and concerned looks from other orchestra members. "Maestro," Melody said, approaching hesitantly, "we're ready to begin whenever you are. Is everything all right?" André accepted the water from Margaret and forced himself to focus on the present moment. Yes, of course. Just a moment of pre-performance nerves. It happens to all of us, even after all these years." But as he prepared to make his entrance, André's mind was racing. How should he handle this situation? Should he acknowledge Eleanor's presence somehow, or pretend he hadn't seen her? How could he possibly perform with the emotional weight of 31 years of regret sitting in his front row? Meanwhile, in the audience, Eleanor was fighting her own emotional battle. Seeing André again, even from a distance, had brought back a flood of memories and feelings she thought she had successfully buried. Timothy noticed her increased agitation and leaned closer to her wheelchair. "Grandma, are you sure you're okay? You seem different since we arrived. If you're not feeling well, we can leave any time. I don't want you to push yourself beyond your limits." Eleanor reached over and patted her grandson's hand. "I'm fine, dear, just remembering things I haven't thought about in a very long time." "What kind of things?" Timothy asked gently. "You've never told me much about your life before you became my guardian. I know you were a music professor, but there's so much I don't know about your experiences." Eleanor looked at her grandson, this wonderful young man who had brought so much joy and purpose to her later years, and realized that he was about to learn things about her past that would change how he understood his grandmother forever. "Timothy," she said carefully, "there are parts of our lives that we keep private because they're too complicated to explain, or because the people involved deserve their privacy. Tonight, you might learn things about me that will surprise you." Before Timothy could ask what she meant, the stage lights dimmed and a hush fell over the massive audience. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. André Rieu appeared from the wings, and despite his emotional turmoil, he managed to summon his trademark smile and energy as he strode toward center stage. The audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever, with people rising to their feet in anticipation of the musical journey they were about to share. "Good evening, New York," André called out, his voice carrying clearly across the great lawn through the powerful sound system. "Are you ready for a magical night of music under the stars?" The crowd roared its approval, but André's eyes were already searching the front rows, looking for Eleanor's face among the thousands present. When he spotted her, still seated in her wheelchair in the accessibility section, his heart began pounding again. She was looking directly at him, and even from the stage, he could see that she recognized him just as clearly as he recognized her. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance and decades, and André felt as if time had stopped completely. Here was the woman who had shaped his understanding of music and love, the woman whose heart he had broken in pursuit of the very career that had brought him to this stage tonight. Eleanor, seeing André's gaze find her in the crowd, felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked older, of course. His dark hair had gone silver, and his face showed the lines that come with age and experience. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her with such love and desperation all those years ago, and she could see that he was struggling with the same flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Tonight," André continued, forcing himself to address the full audience rather than just the one person who commanded all his attention, "we're going to take a journey through the most beautiful music ever written. We're going to laugh, we're going to cry, and we're going to remember why music has the power to touch the deepest parts of our souls." The orchestra began the opening strains of the Blue Danube, and André raised his violin to his chin. But as he began to play, his usual graceful confidence was absent. His hands were shaking slightly, and several times he missed entrances that he had played perfectly thousands of times before. Melody, playing just a few feet away from him, noticed immediately that something was wrong. André's timing was off. His intonation was less precise than usual, and most concerning of all, he seemed distracted in a way that was completely unlike his normal performance demeanor. "The maestro seems different tonight," she whispered to Marcus during a brief pause between movements. "Have you ever seen him this unsettled during a performance?" Marcus had indeed noticed, and as a long-time member of the orchestra, he was concerned. "He keeps looking at someone in the front row," he replied quietly. "That woman in the wheelchair. There's some kind of history there. I can see it in his face." In the audience, Roland Matthews was capturing everything through his camera lens, but he too had noticed that André seemed less polished than usual. "Something's not right with him tonight," he murmured to his neighbors. "He looks like he's seen a ghost." "Maybe he's just having an off night," the woman beside him suggested. "Even the greatest performers have moments when they're not at their absolute best." But Roland, with his trained eye for human emotion, wasn't convinced. He adjusted his telephoto lens to get a better view of André's face, and was struck by the intensity of emotion he saw there. This wasn't stage fright or an off night. This was something much deeper and more personal. As the concert progressed through familiar pieces, waltzes by Strauss, selections from popular operas, and André's signature arrangements that made classical music accessible to mainstream audiences, The tension between André and Eleanor continued to build. Every time André's eyes found her face in the crowd, he seemed to falter slightly, and Eleanor could see that her presence was affecting him as powerfully as his affected her. Timothy, watching his grandmother closely, noticed that she wasn't listening to the music in the way he had expected. Instead of the peaceful enjoyment he had anticipated, she seemed almost agitated, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair with an intensity that made him worry about her blood pressure. "Grandma," he whispered, "you seem tense. Are you sure you're comfortable? We could move to the back where it's less crowded." Eleanor shook her head without taking her eyes off André. "No, Timothy. I need to be here, exactly where we are." As the first half of the concert drew to a close, André announced that they would take a brief intermission before continuing with the evening's program. But instead of leaving the stage as he normally would, he remained standing at center stage, his violin hanging at his side, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. The audience began the normal intermission activities, stretching, visiting the restrooms, checking their phones. But many noticed that André wasn't moving. Some began to murmur among themselves, wondering if something was wrong. Eleanor, feeling the weight of André's gaze from across the distance, made a decision that surprised even herself. Despite her age and the difficulty of maneuvering her wheelchair through the crowd, she began trying to move toward the edge of her seating area. "Grandma, where are you going?" Timothy asked in alarm, immediately moving to help guide her wheelchair. I need to speak with him," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion she could no longer contain. Timothy looked between his grandmother and the figure on the distant stage, finally beginning to understand that there was a connection here that went far beyond simple musical appreciation. "You know him, don't you? You actually know André Rieu personally?" Eleanor nodded, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I knew him when he was young and struggling and full of dreams. I helped him become the musician you see on that stage tonight. And She paused, struggling to find words for feelings that had been buried for over 3 decades. "He broke my heart in ways I never thought I'd recover from." The revelation hit Timothy like a physical blow. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him with such quiet dignity and strength, had lived an entire life of love and loss that he had never suspected. "Grandma, I had no idea. You never told me about any serious relationships. I thought you'd been alone since Grandpa died." "Some stories are too painful to tell," Eleanor replied, still watching André, who remained motionless on the stage. "And some wounds never completely heal, no matter how many years pass." Around them, other audience members were beginning to notice the unusual situation. André was clearly looking at someone specific in the crowd, and his expression was one of such intense emotion that it was impossible to ignore. Roland, still filming, had focused his camera on André's face and was capturing the raw emotion playing across his features. "This is incredible," he whispered to himself. "Something major is happening here." Then, without warning, André made a decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of leaving for intermission, he raised his microphone and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying an unusual vulnerability that immediately captured everyone's attention. Sometimes life presents us with moments that are more important than the performance we had planned." A murmur of confusion ran through the crowd. This was not the cheerful, entertaining André Rieu they had expected. "There is someone in our audience tonight," André continued, his eyes fixed directly on Eleanor. "Someone from my past who changed my life in ways I've never been able to adequately express. Someone I owe more than I could ever repay, and someone I hurt more deeply than I have ever been able to forgive myself for." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Eleanor felt her heart stop as she realized what André was doing. After 31 years of silence, he was about to make their private history public in front of thousands of strangers. 31 years ago, André said, his voice now barely above a whisper but still carrying clearly through the sound system. "I was a struggling musician with more dreams than talent. I had technical skill, but no soul in my playing. I was going through the motions of making music without understanding what music was truly meant to accomplish." Timothy looked at his grandmother with growing amazement, beginning to piece together the story that was unfolding before them. "A remarkable woman took a chance on me," André continued. "A professor who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She didn't just teach me to play music, she taught me to feel music, to understand that every note has emotional purpose, that music is the language we use to connect with each other's deepest experiences." Eleanor was crying openly now, remembering the hours they had spent together in her studio, the way André had gradually transformed from a technically competent but emotionally cold player into an artist who could move audiences to tears. "She gave me everything," André said, his own voice breaking with emotion. "Her knowledge, her connections, her belief in my potential, and she gave me something even more precious. She gave me her love. For 3 years I lived in the light of that love, and it was the happiest time of my life." The audience was transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing something far more intimate and powerful than any traditional concert performance. "But then success came calling," André continued, "and I was faced with a choice. I could stay with the woman who had given me everything, or I could pursue a career that would make me famous and wealthy, but would require me to pretend that she didn't exist." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering the devastating night when André had told her about the recording contract and its requirements. "I chose success," André said simply. "I chose fame over love, career over loyalty, personal ambition over the woman who had made my dreams possible. And in doing so, I made the greatest mistake of my life." He paused, gathering courage for what he was about to do. "Professor Eleanor Richardson," he said, speaking her name for the first time in over 3 decades. "If you can forgive a foolish old man who has spent every day of the last 31 years regretting the choice he made, I would like to ask for something I don't deserve." André set down his violin and stepped off the stage. Security moved to intercept him, but he brushed past them with a determination that made it clear he would not be deterred. The entire audience turned to watch as he walked directly through the seating area toward the front row, toward Eleanor's wheelchair. "Oh my God," Roland whispered, his camera following André's progress. "He's going to her." Timothy looked between his grandmother and the approaching figure with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Grandma, do you want me to get you away from here? If this is too much—" "No," Eleanor said firmly, wiping tears from her cheeks. "It's time. After all these years, it's finally time." André stopped directly in front of Eleanor's wheelchair. The thousands of people in the audience fell completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and intensely personal. For a long moment, André and Eleanor simply looked at each other, each seeing past the physical changes wrought by 3 decades to the people they had once been. "Eleanor," André said softly, and in that single word was contained all the love, regret, and longing of 31 years. "André," she replied, and her voice carried the same weight of history and emotion. And then, to the complete astonishment of everyone present, André Rieu slowly sank to his knees on the grass before Eleanor's wheelchair. "Forgive me," he said, his voice breaking completely. "Please, after all these years, after all the pain I caused you, please find it in your heart to forgive me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. 5,000 people held their breath, witnesses to a moment of vulnerability and raw humanity that none of them had expected to see. Eleanor looked down at this man, who had been both her greatest joy and her deepest heartbreak. She saw not the internationally famous musician, but the struggling 43-year-old who had once sat nervously in her studio, asking for help to find his dreams. Slowly, with hands that trembled from age and emotion, she reached toward him and gently touched his cheek. "André," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "look at me." He raised his head, and she could see that he was crying as hard as she was. "Do you know why I came to your concert tonight?" she asked. "No," he whispered. "I came because I'm 91 years old, and I've carried the pain of our separation for too long. I came because I needed to see what you had become, to know whether the sacrifice we both made was worth something." She paused, looking around at the thousands of people hanging on every word. "And now I know," she continued. "You became everything I knew you could become. You brought joy to millions of people. You made classical music accessible to audiences who would never have discovered its beauty otherwise. You fulfilled every dream we talked about in my studio all those years ago." André was sobbing now, overwhelmed by emotions he had suppressed for decades. "So yes, André Rieu," Eleanor said with quiet dignity, "I forgive you, but more than that, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, proud of the happiness you've brought to the world, proud that I played a small part in helping you become the artist you were meant to be." The release of emotion that swept through the audience was unprecedented. People were crying openly, holding strangers, feeling as though they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment and touched the very essence of human experience. "But," Eleanor continued, "there's something I need you to do for me now. Anything, André said immediately. "I want you to get up, go back to that stage, and play for all these people who came to hear your music. Play with all the passion and joy I taught you to feel. Play the way you played for me in my studio, when it was just the two of us and the music and nothing else mattered." She leaned forward and whispered something in his ear that only he could hear. André's eyes widened with surprise and emotion. She had asked him to play Eleanor's song, the piece he had composed for her during their last weeks together, but had never performed publicly because it was too personal, too filled with the pain of their separation. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "I'm certain," she replied. "It's time for our song to be heard." André rose slowly to his feet, his knees stiff from kneeling on the ground. He looked once more at Eleanor, seeing forgiveness and peace in her eyes, then turned to walk back to the stage. As he made his way through the audience, spontaneous applause began. Not the enthusiastic clapping of entertainment, but the deeper, more respectful applause of people who recognized they had witnessed something profound and sacred. Back on stage, André picked up his violin with hands that were steadier than they had been all evening. He looked out over the crowd, then back to Eleanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "what you have just witnessed was 31 years in the making. There are people in our lives who shape us, who teach us who we really are, and sometimes, if we're incredibly fortunate, we get the chance to thank them properly and ask for the forgiveness we don't deserve but desperately need." He raised his violin to his chin, but before he began playing, he spoke once more. "This next piece, I wrote it 31 years ago, but I've never played it in public. It's a song about love and loss, about the terrible choices we sometimes make, about regret and the hope for redemption. Tonight, for the first time, I'm going to share it with you. This is Eleanor's song." The first notes that emerged from André's violin were unlike anything the audience had ever heard from him before. This wasn't a familiar waltz or a crowd-pleasing arrangement of a classical standard. This was pure emotion made audible, 31 years of longing and regret and love, transformed into music that seemed to come directly from the depths of his soul. The melody began softly, tentatively, like a memory struggling to surface after years of being suppressed. But as André continued playing, the music grew in complexity and emotional depth, weaving together themes of young love and painful separation, of dreams achieved and prices paid, of the ways we wound the people we love most when we're too frightened or ambitious to choose wisely. The orchestra, though they had never seen this piece before, began to find their way into the music, their instruments seeking harmony with André's lead violin. Melody found herself crying as she played, moved by music that transcended technical skill and became pure expression of human experience. "This is incredible," Roland whispered to his companion, still filming despite the tears streaming down his own face. "I've never heard anything like this. This isn't just music. This is a man's entire emotional life laid bare." In the audience, people were completely silent, transfixed by the raw honesty and beauty of what they were hearing. This wasn't the light, joyful music many had expected from an André Rieu concert. This was something much deeper, music that reached into their own experiences of love and loss and regret, that reminded them of their own roads not taken and their own needs for forgiveness. Eleanor listened with her eyes closed, remembering the night André had first played this melody for her in her apartment overlooking Central Park. He had been nervous then, uncertain whether she would understand what he was trying to say through music rather than words. Now, 3 decades later, she could hear how the simple melody she remembered had grown and deepened, had been enriched by years of experience and shaped by the very pain that their separation had caused. Timothy watched his grandmother's face as she listened, finally beginning to understand the depth of the relationship that had existed between her and the man on the stage. "Grandma," he whispered, "this is beautiful. Did he really write this for you?" Eleanor nodded without opening her eyes. "It was our song," she said softly, "the last gift he gave me before everything fell apart." As Eleanor's song reached its emotional crescendo, André poured everything into his performance. All the success that had felt hollow without someone to share it with, all the nights he had lain awake wondering what might have been, all the love he had carried for Eleanor even as he convinced himself he had moved on with his life. The music gradually grew softer, returning to the simple, tender theme with which it had begun, but now it was transformed, no longer a song of loss and longing, but of acceptance and peace, of forgiveness given and received, of love that endures even when the people who share it cannot. When the last note faded into the warm Manhattan evening, the silence that followed was complete and profound. Then, Slowly, the applause began. It built gradually, thousands of people rising to their feet in recognition of something extraordinary they had just experienced. André lowered his violin and looked toward Eleanor. She was clapping too, her eyes shining with tears and something that looked like completion, as if a circle that had been left open for 31 years had finally been closed. He approached the microphone one final time that evening. 31 years ago, he said, his voice now calm and certain, I wrote that song for the woman who taught me that music is love made audible. I thought I would never be able to play it because I believed I had lost the right to sing about love. His voice grew stronger as he continued, but tonight Eleanor taught me one final lesson. She taught me that forgiveness doesn't just free us from the past. It gives us the courage to finally tell our truth, to share the deepest parts of ourselves without fear of judgment or rejection. The applause continued, but André held up his hand to speak once more. I know this wasn't the concert you came for tonight, he said, looking out over the vast audience, but sometimes life gives us moments that are more important than what we planned, moments that remind us why we're here and what really matters. This was better than any concert, someone shouted from the middle of the crowd, and others voiced their agreement, understanding that they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment and touched the fundamental questions of how we love, how we fail, and how we find our way back to each other. As the official concert concluded and the audience began to disperse, André didn't head for the artist's area or the waiting cars that would take him back to his hotel. Instead, he walked directly back to Eleanor, carrying his violin case and moving with a lightness that suggested a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. How does it feel? Eleanor asked as he reached her wheelchair. Like I can finally breathe again, André answered honestly. Like I've been holding my breath for 31 years and can finally let it out. Timothy had watched the entire evening with growing amazement, understanding for the first time that his grandmother had lived a rich, complex, emotional life long before she became his caregiver and guardian. Grandma, he said gently, why didn't you ever tell me about all of this, about your relationship with him? Eleanor smiled at her grandson with the particular affection she reserved for him alone. Because some stories can only be told when they're finished, Timothy. Our story, André's and mine, wasn't finished until tonight. She looked up at André, who was standing beside her wheelchair with an expression of peace that seemed to have replaced decades of regret. What happens now? She asked him. André considered the question carefully. Would you allow me to take you for coffee tomorrow? We have 31 years to catch up on, and I'd like to hear about your life, your achievements, your experiences. I'd like to know who you became after I was no longer part of your story. I'd like that very much, Eleanor replied. Timothy, would you mind if an old friend joined us for coffee tomorrow afternoon? Timothy looked between his grandmother and André, still processing the magnitude of what had been revealed that evening. Of course not, Grandma. I think I'd like to hear some of those stories you've never told me. As Timothy pushed Eleanor's wheelchair toward the park's exit with André walking alongside them, other audience members watched with satisfaction and wonder. Many had recorded portions of the evening on their phones, and by morning, videos of André's public apology and his performance of Eleanor's song would be viewed millions of times around the world, touching people who had never attended a classical music concert but were moved by the story of love, loss, and redemption they had witnessed. Roland Matthews, still processing what he had captured through his camera lens, carefully packed his equipment, with hands that continued to shake from emotional overwhelm. My wife is never going to believe this, he murmured to himself. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself. He knew that when he returned to Sarah's hospital room the next morning, he would have something far more powerful than a simple concert recording to share with her. He would have documentation of a moment that proved love and forgiveness can endure even the worst mistakes we make. Melody and the other orchestra members were quietly packing their instruments, still moved by the music they had just performed and the story they had witnessed unfold. In 20 years of professional performing, the lead cellist said to his colleagues, I've never been part of anything like that. That wasn't just music, that was healing happening in real time. As the last stragglers left Central Park and the cleanup crew began dismantling the temporary stage, the Great Lawn returned to its usual peaceful state. But the magic of what had happened there would linger in the memories of everyone present, a reminder that love, forgiveness, and second chances are among the most powerful forces available to human beings. The three people walking together through the cooling Manhattan evening, Eleanor, Timothy, and André, represented something precious and rare, the possibility of redemption, the courage to admit our failures, and the grace to forgive even when forgiveness seems impossible. As they reached the park's edge where Timothy's car was parked, André turned to Eleanor one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the chance to apologize, for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it, and for teaching me that some songs are worth waiting 31 years to play." Eleanor reached up and touched his hand gently. "Thank you for becoming everything I knew you could become," she replied. "And thank you for finally playing our song." 3 months later, André would announce that his next album would be dedicated to the teacher who showed me that the heart is the only instrument that really matters. Eleanor would be his honored guest at the recording sessions, offering suggestions and encouragement just as she had 3 decades earlier. Their relationship transformed from romantic love to deep friendship built on shared history and mutual respect. Timothy would gradually learn more details about his grandmother's past, understanding finally why she had always spoken so passionately about the power of music to heal and transform human experience. He would also witness the rejuvenating effect that reconnecting with André had on Eleanor's spirit, as if forgiving him had lifted a weight she had carried for too long. Millions of people around the world would discover the story through social media and news coverage, finding in it a message of hope that resonated across cultures and generations. Eleanor's song would become one of André's most requested pieces, and concert videos would circulate endlessly, inspiring countless discussions about love, forgiveness, and the courage required to make amends for our past mistakes. The story would be retold in magazines, featured in documentaries, and become the subject of academic papers about the psychology of forgiveness and the power of music to facilitate emotional healing. Marriage counselors would show the video to couples struggling with trust and betrayal. Therapists would use it as an example of how redemption remains possible even after decades of separation and hurt. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor and André would spend their remaining years as dear friends, meeting regularly for coffee and conversation, attending each other's birthday celebrations, and occasionally playing music together in the small practice room at Eleanor's assisted living facility. Their love story would have a different ending than either had imagined, but it would be an ending characterized by peace, forgiveness, and the deep satisfaction that comes from finally making things right. The evening in Central Park would be remembered not just as a concert where something unexpected happened, but as a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the transformative power of having the courage to ask for forgiveness and the grace to grant it. In a world often divided by anger and resentment, André and Eleanor had shown that love endures, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the most beautiful music emerges from the willingness to be completely vulnerable in front of those we have wronged. Their story would continue to inspire people for years to come, serving as a reminder that it's never too late to make amends, that genuine love leaves marks on the soul that time cannot erase, and that the most important performances we give in life are not on stages, but in the quiet moments when we find the strength to admit our failures and seek the forgiveness that can set us free.